The dust clung to everything in Sapporo like an old grudge. It coated the adobe walls, settled in the creases of men's faces, and hung in the air like the ghost of unfinished business. The sun beat down mercilessly on Main Street, where the boards of the general store porch groaned under the slow steps of a giant man in a brown hat. Jeremiah Jed Thornton, broad as a barn door, silent as dusk, was cinching the bridle on his mare, Constance, when a small hand tugged the edge of his long duster. He looked down and froze. A little girl stood there, maybe 6 years old, barefoot and shaking, with dust on her face and a tear track cutting through it like a dried-up riverbed. Her light blue dress was ripped at the hem, one shoulder slipping down a tiny arm, scratched raw from brambles. In one hand, she clutched a battered wooden doll missing its left arm. In the other, she gripped nothing but air. "Mister," she whispered, voice hoarse from sun and fear. "Please follow me home." "Mama won't wake up." Jed didn't move at first. He just stared. His hands had stopped tying the bridle. His breath had stopped too. That voice, that look. It wasn't just the dust or the heat making his vision blur. "Where's your home, little one?" he asked gently, kneeling until they were eye to eye. "Past the rocks that look like sleeping giants," she said, pointing east toward the edge of the desert. "Follow the dry creek till it bends. Then follow the bend till you see our house." She spoke like someone repeating a mantra she'd held on to for days. Jed exhaled slowly, looked to the horizon. Nothing but miles of heat, shimmer, and dead land. "You got a name." "Amelia." She squared her thin shoulders. "Amelia Morrison." That last name punched the air out of Jed's lungs like a well-aimed fist. Morrison. His jaw clenched. That name had stories attached to it, long shadows and long memories. But the girl didn't know that. All she knew was her world had cracked in two. Jed stood up, towering over her. His shadow swallowed her completely. Without another word, he lifted her gently onto the saddle and swung up behind her. Constance snorted softly but didn't flinch. The old buckskin mare knew when the stakes were different. As they rode out of Sapporo, nobody stopped them. A few townsfolk watched from behind curtains or under tilted hats. Nobody asked questions, because when a man like Jed Thornton rides out of town with a child on his hip and a look like stone on his face, you don't interrupt. Amelia didn't say much. She just leaned back into him like she'd decided he was safe. Her body felt like a whisper against his chest, thin and dry. She smelled like sunburnt weeds and old fear. "My brothers are gone," she murmured as they reached the creek bed. "Tommy and Samuel. Papa took them. Mama said she'd come for them when she got better. But then she didn't." Jed's throat tightened. The desert around them hummed with heat and silence, and he could feel the girl's heart pounding against his ribs. "How long's she been asleep, Amelia?" She was quiet for a beat too long. 3 days, she said finally. "I kept thinking maybe she just needed more rest." Jed said nothing. The wind said enough. They rode another hour, maybe more. The sun dipped lower, bleeding into the canyon walls like a warning. The land changed, got sharper, crueler. Thornbrush clawed at the horse's legs. The rocks twisted up from the ground like ancient bones. And then the house came into view. It wasn't much. A squat adobe shack half sunk between two hills, roof patched with tin and prayer. A broken fence sagged around a patch of bare yard. Chickens pecked listlessly near a tipped-over bucket. A cow lay in the shade of a half-dead cottonwood, ribs sharp as the desert horizon. Amelia slid down from the saddle before he could help. "Mama!" she called. Her voice cracked. "Mama, I brought help!" Jed followed her inside, ducking under the crooked doorway. The moment he stepped in, he knew. The air was still. Too still. It smelled sweet. Not in a good way. She lay on a thin straw mattress in the corner, covered with a quilt faded to nearly colorless. Her hands were folded neatly across her chest. Her eyes were closed, but the skin was yellow-gray, the kind of stillness that didn't belong to sleep. "Mama," Amelia said again, kneeling beside her. She touched her mother's hand, then leaned close and whispered, "The nice man came, just like you said he would." Jed swallowed hard. She's with the angels now, baby," he said softly. Amelia didn't cry. Not then. She just sat there, her small hand on her mother's cold arm. "I think I already knew," she whispered. Jed knelt beside her, looked into those wide blue eyes, eyes that didn't blink much anymore, eyes that had seen too much for their age. He stood and walked out into the yard. The sun was dipping now, low enough to touch the tops of the hills. He looked around, found a shovel leaning against the fence, and began to dig. The ground fought him, baked hard by sun and sorrow. Every thrust of the shovel jostled old bones in his memory. Another grave, another loss, another thing the world demanded he bury. He didn't look up when Amelia came outside. She wanted to face the sunrise, she said. She always said new days were hopeful. Jed turned the grave east. His hands bled from blisters he hadn't earned in years. He wrapped the mother's body in the quilt she died under, and when he lifted her, she weighed nothing. That was what broke him. Not the death, not even the silence, but the lightness. The woman had wasted away to protect her children, to wait for help that didn't come until it was too late. He lowered her into the ground. Amelia placed a tiny bunch of desert wildflowers on the chest. Then she knelt, folded her hands, and recited something with the steadiness of a child who'd had no choice but to grow up too fast. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Her voice didn't quiver once. Jed stared at her, and in that moment he didn't see just Amelia. He saw Sarah, his daughter, taken at age 5. He hadn't dug that grave himself. He couldn't. He'd been too broken. But here he was with a second chance that didn't feel like one. When they finished filling the grave, he shaped a crude cross from 2 broken slats from the chicken coop. He carved the words with his pocket knife, "Beloved Mother." Amelia looked up at him, hair tangled, skin pale, eyes old. "What happens now?" she asked. Jed took a long breath. "For now," he said, "you're coming home with me." She nodded like that made perfect sense, and just before they rode off, she tugged on his sleeve again. "You're not like Papa," she said. "Your hands don't shake when you're near me." Jed looked at her. "Where is your father now, Amelia?" She looked away. "He came one night, mad. Mama tried to stop him, but she was too sick. He took Tommy and Samuel, said they were old enough to work. And your papa's name?" She hesitated, then looked back at him. "Black Jack Morrison." The name hit Jed like a cold iron to the spine. Black Jack Morrison, the same outlaw who had once burned a trail through New Mexico, the same man who had vanished after a string of killings. The same man Jed had sworn to hang with his own hands if they ever crossed paths again. And now he was holding that man's daughter in his arms. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide what to do about it. But tonight, as the last light bled into the desert, he held the reins tighter and wrapped his coat around Amelia's small shoulders. She leaned into him without a word, like a child who had finally decided to believe. He didn't know what kind of hell Morrison had dragged those boys into, but he did know one thing. He was going to bring them back, even if it killed him. The grave sat quiet beneath the cottonwood tree, the dirt still fresh and soft. Wind moved through the brittle leaves like breath through old lungs. Amelia knelt by the mound, fingers wrapped tight around the neck of her headless doll. She whispered a prayer she'd heard her mother say every night, voice breaking only once on the word, safe. Jeremiah. Jed Thornton stood a few paces away, arms crossed over his chest. He watched the girl and felt something burn behind his eyes. It wasn't just pity, it was something older, deeper, like a root twisting inside him that hadn't moved in 20 years. He'd buried women before. He'd buried his wife, Claire, and his daughter, Sarah. But not like this, not in silence, not while a child watched. When Amelia finished, she rose slowly. Her face was streaked with dust and salt, but she didn't cry, not the way most children did. She seemed practiced, hollowed out from within. "Do you want to go now?" she asked. Jed looked toward the horse, then back at the house. "I want to take a look around first," he said. She didn't protest, just turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. Jed ducked beneath the crooked lintel and stepped into the gloom. The place smelled like rot and empty time. The bed where the mother had died was still unmade. A cracked basin of water sat on the table, untouched. The walls were bare except for a sun-bleached Bible verse written in chalk. "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge." He stepped across the floorboards, careful not to make noise. Old habits. His boots creaked once, and he paused, then again near the hearth. There was something underfoot. He crouched, fingers brushing along the edge of a warped board. It shifted when he pressed down. He pried it up with his knife. Beneath it, a tin box, rusted at the corners and wrapped in cloth. He sat on the floor, box in lap, and opened it. Inside, a small stack of folded letters, brittle with age. A photograph of a young woman holding 2 boys and a girl, all barefoot, smiling in front of the same house. And at the very bottom, a leather-bound notebook with a broken spine. Jed opened the notebook and read the first line, written in neat, unsure hand. "If anyone finds this and I'm gone, I hope you'll understand why I kept my children away from their father." His breath caught. He turned the page. Blackjack Morrison is not just their father. He is a killer. He hurt people. He hurt me. He's the reason I ran. Jed froze. He knew that name like he knew the weight of a colt in his palm. Blackjack Morrison. He was the reason Jed had put down his rifle, left his badge behind, and vanished into the quiet. Blackjack was the reason Sarah never reached her 6th birthday. Claire had taken her into town that day just for fabric and bread, a routine trip. But a stagecoach robbery gone sideways changed everything. 3 dead, including a 6-year-old girl with a ribbon in her hair. Witnesses said the leader laughed when he shot her. That leader was Blackjack Morrison. Jed had hunted him for a year after that. A full year. Got within a mile of him once. Then Blackjack vanished like smoke, taking his trail of blood with him. And now, Jed was sitting in a dead woman's house, reading her confession that she had children by that same man. His pulse thudded in his ears. He flipped another page. He told me he'd changed, that he wanted a family. He said all the killing was behind him. I was young. I believed him. There were details. Abuse, fleeing in the middle of the night, running to Socorro because it was the place nobody important goes. She thought she could hide here, build a life. Jed closed the notebook and stared at the floor. He wanted to feel rage, but all he felt was tired. He had spent so many years trying to forget. Now the past had come riding back to him on the shoulders of a 6-year-old girl with calloused feet and a cracked doll. The screen door squeaked behind him. "I wasn't supposed to find that, was I?" Amelia said softly. Jed turned to her. "No, but I think your mama wanted somebody to." She stepped inside, walked up to him. "You read the part about Papa?" He nodded. "I don't remember him much." Just loud and fast hands. She looked down at the notebook. "Mama said if he ever came back, we should run." That's why she kept the boys' names off school rolls. Jed stood slowly, towering above her again. You said he took your brothers. Uh-huh, she said. Last year. Said they needed to learn how to pull their weight. Tommy's 9. Samuel's barely 8. Jed's jaw clenched. And you've seen him since? She shook her head. Mama said if he found us again, there'd be no running left. Jed walked to the window. The sun was low now, turning the desert gold, bleeding into rust. You have anywhere else to go? He asked. She looked at him, calm as a priest. You? He met her gaze. Her answer wasn't hopeful. It was factual, as if the decision had already been made, as if she knew no one else would do what had to be done. He took a breath. All right. She nodded once and went to pack a small cloth sack, a few scraps of clothes, a tin comb, a cracked plate wrapped in a shirt. He watched her move, efficient, small, serious. She had no childhood left in her. Blackjack had taken it piece by piece. When they mounted up to leave, Jed hesitated at the fence. He turned back to the house. The setting sun cast long shadows over the porch. It looked like a place where hope had died quietly. He'd burn it in the morning. It wasn't fit to stand anymore. But just as he reached for the reins, Amelia tugged his coat again. Mr. Jed? Yeah? She pointed to a pile of rocks near the fence post. There's something buried there. Mama made me promise not to tell unless something real bad happened. Jed dismounted, walked over. The rocks were arranged too neatly to be accidental. He knelt and began pulling them away. After the 5th one, he saw the edge of an oilskin bundle. He uncovered it. Inside, a rusted 6-shooter, a faded U.S. Marshal badge, and a letter. He picked up the badge slowly. It wasn't just any badge. It was his, the one he'd thrown into the Pecos River the night after Sarah's funeral. He unfolded the note. Jed, if you're reading this, it means the storm found me. I knew it would. I kept this for you. I knew one day you'd come back. His hand trembled. The letter wasn't signed, but the handwriting. He remembered it. It belonged to Claire. He stared at the badge, at the name etched faintly into the back. J.J.T. He never told Claire where he'd tossed it, but somehow she had found it and kept it. The sun slipped below the horizon. Behind him, Amelia climbed into the saddle and looked back. Mr. Jed, she asked again. He stood slowly, badge in hand, and for the first time in 2 decades felt the weight of purpose return to his shoulders. We're not going back to town just yet, he said. We're heading north. Why north? Because if Blackjack took your brothers, he'll be headed to old mining camps. He mounted up behind her. And if he's still out there, Jed said, voice like gravel, I'm gonna find him. The girl looked up at him, her face catching the last of the light. And if you do, Jed's voice dropped, then he'll wish he stayed dead. They rode in silence across the dry basin, hoofbeats muffled by sand and scrub. The wind carried dust like breath from something ancient and watching, and every so often a lizard darted beneath the belly of Jed's horse. Amelia sat small in front of him, holding the saddle horn with both hands, her little back rigid but warm against his chest. She hadn't spoken much since they left the grave. Jed didn't push her. He remembered silence like that. He'd lived inside it once. The sky above them opened wide, a pale blue stretching forever. It reminded him of the days he used to wear a badge, back when he still believed law meant something in a place like this. The memory settled on his shoulders like an old coat. There'd been a time when he'd ridden these lands not to escape, but to guard. When people had tipped their hats to him in towns like Willow Ridge and Pecos Crossing, and little boys had asked if he'd ever drawn his revolver in real trouble. He remembered answering once, "Trouble don't give you time to count seconds, son. Just gives you the choice to shoot or die." That had been before Claire. Before Sarah. His hand tightened on the reins as the ghost of her face shimmered in his mind, Claire's pale hair tangled in the wind, her smile soft as snowmelt. Sarah's little laugh trailing behind her as she ran barefoot through wildflowers behind the old chapel in Waco Gulch. He hadn't been there the day they died. That was what haunted him most. He'd been out on patrol, chasing down a lead on stolen cattle that turned out to be nothing more than boys joyriding with their uncle's brand. By the time he rode back, the town was fire and screams. A stagecoach had pulled in. The wrong men had stepped off. They weren't there to rob. They were there to kill. 3 townsfolk dead, Claire and Sarah among them. The sheriff's office claimed it was a random attack, but Jed saw the pattern. 2 months later, the man who testified against Blackjack Morrison disappeared. Then the judge who'd sentenced him was found hanging in his own barn. Jed started digging. He found whispers, names scratched off ledger books, witnesses gone silent. A marshal in Kansas who said Blackjack didn't just disappear. He buried himself deep. And then one day, after chasing a trail that twisted cold through 4 states, Jed came across a dying man in a saloon cellar. He'd been shot in the gut, bleeding slow. Before he died, he looked up at Jed and muttered, "Blackjack," said the Thornton girl was the message. Jed never told anyone. He'd thrown away his badge that night, tossed his guns in the river too, thinking if he disappeared, maybe vengeance would die with him. But now, 20 years later, vengeance had found him again, riding in the form of a girl with calloused feet and the same fire in her eyes that used to flicker in Sarah's. "Are we almost there?" Amelia asked, voice suddenly cutting through the dust. "Another hour," he said. She leaned back a little, just enough for her head to brush against his chest. "Your place? It got a bed?" Jed gave a dry smile. "It's not the Ritz, but yeah." "Got a bed?" She was quiet a beat. Then she asked, "You gonna give me to somebody?" He didn't answer right away. "I mean," she went on, "you don't got to raise me or nothing. Just don't give me to a preacher or some folks looking for free labor." Mama said there'd be someone, a man. He'd come when the time was right. "Maybe that's you," he looked down at her. "You don't even know me." Amelia shrugged, still facing forward. "Don't need to." Mama said the man she meant would carry a sword, not just a gun. "I don't know what that means yet, but I think it's you." Jed felt something catch in his chest. "You think I carry a sword?" "You buried Mama," she said simply. "You didn't have to." "But you did it right." Jed fell silent. His ranch came into view just before sundown, nestled in a shallow valley rimmed by low ridgelines, the barn leaning but solid, and the cabin still standing despite years of storms. He'd built it with his own hands, every board nailed to bury a memory. Amelia looked up at it, eyes narrowing with curiosity. "This it?" "This is it." He helped her down. She stood still for a long moment, then walked toward the porch, stopping at the door. He watched her lift the latch and step in like she'd lived there before. Inside, she turned in a circle, then pointed to the wall where an old map of New Mexico still hung. "You got boys?" "No." "A wife?" "No." "A dog?" "Used to." She nodded, as if ticking off a list. "Well, now you got me." Jed gave a small grunt. "That's so." "Yeah, I mean, unless you say otherwise." He sat down at the kitchen table. The chair creaked beneath his weight. "Yo, you always this bold." "Mama said the world eats quiet girls first." He stared at her for a long moment. "Your mama was smart." Amelia went to the sink, turned the handle, waited. Nothing came out. "Well," she muttered, "maybe the world eats loud girls too if they pick the wrong house." Jed let out a low chuckle. That night she slept in the spare room. The bed hadn't been touched in years. He found a wool blanket in the trunk and tucked it around her. She held her doll close, the eyes missing and one arm torn off. "Do you want me to leave the lamp on?" "No, but can you sit a while?" He did. He sat on the edge of the bed until her breathing slowed. Then he walked out to the porch and sat beneath the stars, pipe in hand, badge in his shirt pocket. He had no business raising a child. He'd failed the last one. But something in her voice, something in the way she looked at him, not with hope but with certainty, made him wonder if this wasn't chance at all. Maybe it was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. The next morning, just after sunrise, a shadow moved along the ridge to the north. Jed caught it just as he was splitting firewood. A lone rider, slow, watching. He squinted into the sun and reached for the rifle he hadn't touched in years. Because sometimes the man who carries the sword isn't the one who swings it first. Sometimes he just sees the blade coming, long before it's drawn. The first sign of trouble came with the dust. Not the usual kind kicked up by cattle drives or ranch wagons, but a fine, heavy dust that settled on roofs before midday, thick, gritty, and slow to lift, like the land itself was holding its breath. Jed noticed it the moment he rode into Socorro for supplies. Vicente met him near the water tower, face pale and boots scuffed with urgency. "They're here," he said, without pleasantries. Jed dismounted. "Who's they?" Two men, slick coats, long guns, and the smell of East Texas trouble all over them. Came in asking about a girl, blonde or around 10. Said she's traveling with a man who walks like he's got nothing left to lose. Jed's jaw clenched. "Morrison's men," Vicente gave a grim nod. One called the other Dutch, big. Looked like he ate dynamite for breakfast. They bought drinks at Rosita's and scared off every soul who looked too long. "Anyone talk?" "Tommy Jenkins mentioned he saw you riding with a kid." He didn't know details, but it was enough. "They're watching the main road now," Jed exhaled slowly. "Where are they staying?" "Room above the stable." Guns stacked by the window like they expect a war, and looked down the street to the corner where Doc Henderson's clinic stood, behind a crooked picket fence. "We need to move." Now Vicente grabbed his arm before he could mount again. "Jed, they're not just looking. They're hunting inside the clinic." Dr. Henderson was already waiting. The old man didn't waste time with greetings. "She's the one, isn't she?" The girl Morrison's, after Jed didn't answer, just nodded. Doc sighed. "I stitched up Morrison's first wife after he accidentally threw her down the stairs. She couldn't speak above a whisper for a year. I knew he was the devil back then. Didn't expect his shadow to reach this far." "She's got brothers," Jed said. "2 of them. Morrison took them." Doc rubbed his temples. "So it's not just about hiding the girl. She wants to go back?" "She says they're still alive. Locked somewhere." "She wants to find them." Doc stepped to the window, peeking through a slat. "That girl's carrying more weight than a child should. You think she'll stay hidden if you force her to?" "No," Jed said, quiet, "but I was hoping she'd at least try." They rode back to the ranch fast, dust trailing them like smoke. When Jed entered the cabin, Amelia was at the table, working a knot into the hem of her dress. She looked up and saw the tightness in his shoulders. "You saw them," she said. "I did." "And?" "They're looking." Close, her hands went still. "It's him, isn't it?" My father, Jed, pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "We have to leave. Tonight I'm not leaving," she said softly. "Not without Tommy and Samuel." Jed let out a slow breath. "That wasn't the deal. There was no deal. You're a child. I'm their sister." Jed stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the desert burned gold in the late sun. He turned back to her. "If we go now, we can get far enough to circle back later, once it's safe." "There won't be a later," she snapped. "If they're still alive and I wait, they'll be dead." He stared at her, stunned by the steel in her voice. She looked smaller than ever, but her presence filled the room. "I dreamed of you," she whispered. "When Mama told me someone would come, I saw you. Not your face, just the way you moved, like someone who'd lost everything and still kept walking." Jed didn't know what to say. "I don't want to die," she said, "but I'd rather try and fail than run and live knowing I left them behind." For a long moment, all that filled the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Then Jed nodded slowly. "We'll need a plan." That night, under the cloak of darkness, Vicente brought them maps. Doc offered medicine and a small pouch of coin. Jed saddled 2 horses, leaving the third untethered in the shadows as a decoy. Amelia slipped a folded paper into her pocket, her mother's last letter. They would head south first, toward the canyons near El Cielo, and from there find the trading post where Morrison's men were rumored to gather. But as Jed mounted his horse, he felt a strange stillness in the air. No coyotes, no wind, just silence. And in that silence, the crunch of bootsteps behind the barn. He turned just in time to see a flare of movement. Someone had been watching all along, and they were no longer just asking questions. They rode before the sun touched the peaks, when the desert was still a hush of blue shadows and coyote cries. Jed took the lead, Amelia close behind, her small frame bundled under Vicente's spare jacket. Every few miles, Jed stopped to scout the trail, watching for dust trails, listening for hoofbeats that didn't belong to them. They were headed for Las Cruces by way of Devil's Pass, a narrow canyon route Jed hadn't used in years, one that twisted through stone like a serpent's spine. He'd chosen it not because it was fastest, but because it was forgotten, or so he thought. By mid-morning, the sun had turned cruel, and Jed called for a break under a rock overhang. While Amelia nibbled on jerky and filled her canteen, Jed dug through his saddlebag for a compass and froze. There was something tucked between the folds of his coat. A letter yellowed at the edges. No stamp, no seal, just a name scratched in ink that turned his blood cold. Jedediah McCraw. He unfolded it with rough hands. "I knew you'd come this way. You always did favor the crooked roads. You remember 1864, don't you? In the mud near Ark Hollow. You shot a boy wearing gray. Said it was war. Said you didn't know his name. His name was Eli Morrison. He was my brother. My only one. You put a bullet in his neck while he begged for his life. I've waited 20 years to return the favor. You thought your wife died because she was in the wrong place, that your daughter Sarah was just another victim of some drifter? No, Jed, I planned it. I paid for it. And now I'm almost done. You've got one piece left to lose. Bring me the girl, or I'll bury the boys. Morrison." Jed stared at the letter until the edges blurred. His lungs forgot how to breathe. For years he had told himself what happened to Sarah and Abigail was fate, a consequence of the world's ugliness. But this rewrote everything. It wasn't fate. It was a ledger being settled. He was the target. Amelia was just the bait. And her brother's the trap. He crumpled the letter and stuffed it deep into the coals of a dying campfire. But fire couldn't burn what was already seared into his memory. "Jed," Amelia's voice pulled him back. She stood near the horses, holding her canteen, brows furrowed. "Everything okay?" Jed forced a nod. "Just old ghosts." She didn't push on, but he could see the worry in her eyes. They rode on in silence, deeper into the canyon. The walls grew narrower, the air thick with heat and the scent of creosote. At midday, Jed stopped again and motioned Amelia off her horse. "We walk from here." "Why?" "Too quiet." He led them through the tightest part of the pass, hand near his revolver. Every rock seemed to whisper warning. Every shadow held a memory. Halfway through, he spotted it, a small pile of stones off the trail, two neatly stacked. He dropped to a knee and swept them aside. A tripwire. His fingers trembled. The device was simple, meant to trigger a small blast enough to maim a horse or kill a child. He turned to Amelia, who stared at it wide-eyed. "Who would set something like that?" she whispered. Jed didn't answer. They kept moving, slower now. When they reached the edge of the canyon, the landscape opened wide red hills and brush stretching toward Las Cruces in the distance. But Jed didn't look forward, he looked down. A second tripwire, and next to it a coin, an 1864 Confederate penny. Deliberate, mocking. He picked it up, fingers curling around it like a curse. "I don't understand," Amelia said behind him. "Why would he go this far? Why hurt people who didn't do anything to him?" Jed turned. "Because to him it's not about right or wrong. It's about balance. He thinks I owe him pain, and he's decided you're the weight. But I'm not you." "No," he said, "but you're with me. And that's enough." For the first time, Jed felt something worse than fear. He felt hunted, not just by men, but by the past. They rode on with urgency now. Jed avoided the main roads, circling through arroyos and dry washes until the roofs of Las Cruces peeked over the hills. As they approached the outskirts, Jed noticed something. Smoke. Not the kind from chimneys. Dark, rising smoke. He urged his horse forward. They crested the last ridge, and there at the far end of the town, near the old cattle pens, fire licked the sky. Amelia gasped. Jed didn't need to ask what it was, because hanging from the fence post, blackened and burned, was a cloth scrap. Red flannel, the same shirt Tommy had been wearing in the photo he found back at the cabin. The message was clear. He was too late, or worse, right on time. The abandoned mine lay crouched in a throat of red rock and shadow, its jagged opening like a scar carved into the earth. Jed reined in just beyond a cluster of pines, the canyon walls looming around them like silent jurors. Wind rushed through the dry grass, carrying the scent of iron and rot. Tommy and Samuel were somewhere inside. Amelia's knuckles were white around her saddle horn. "They're in there, aren't they?" Jed nodded slowly. "Stay here. If you hear anything, and I mean anything, you ride for Vicente. Don't wait. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You will if you love them." The words lodged hard in both their throats. Jed drew the blade from his saddlebag. Not a rifle, not a revolver, not a sword weathered, nicked at the edge, the brass hilt engraved with initials barely legible. It had belonged to his father, who'd carried it through Shiloh, through Antietam, through the worst men could do to one another and still walk away. Jed had never used it in battle, not until now. He moved low across the rocks, feet silent over the dust. The mine's front shack sagged like a drunk, its roof half collapsed. But the inside he knew was where they'd be held. He listened. A cough. A boy's voice, muffled. Jed crept closer, slipping through a broken slat. There they were. Tommy, maybe 12 now, bruised and dirt-smeared, but alive. Samuel, a bit older, sat against the wall with a gash across his forehead, cradling his arm. "Boys," Jed whispered. "It's me." Tommy's eyes widened. "Papa?" Jed nearly staggered. Samuel pulled his brother close. "You shouldn't have come. I wasn't about to leave you." He started toward them and froze. 6 rifles clicked into readiness. From the shadows behind the support beams, Morrison emerged. His mustache curled like a snake's grin. Behind him, his men fanned out, all armed, all cocky. "Well now," Morrison drawled, "you always did have a flair for the dramatic, Jed." Jed stepped in front of the boys, hand tightening around the hilt. "Let them go." Go, Morrison chuckled. You walked right into the den and still think you're making demands? You got me. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Oh, I got more than that, Morrison said. I got legacy. I got balance. I've waited half my life to see your face when it ends. Jed glanced at the rifles. You gonna let your dogs do it for you? Morrison's eyes narrowed. Jed raised the sword. Or you gonna finish it yourself? The silence cracked. Morrison spat. Fine. I've been waiting for this, he stepped forward, pulling his coat aside to reveal a curved saber gleaming, like it had been polished for the occasion. He unsheathed it with a hiss. Gentlemen, he barked to his men, stand down. No shots unless he cheats. Morrison tossed. Jed a nod. I want them to see what justice looks like. Jed stepped back, whispering to Samuel, when we start, get your brother and run. Don't look back. Samuel's lip trembled, but he nodded. The duel began without ceremony. No count, no code, just steel meeting steel in a flash of sun and sparks. Morrison came fast and cruel, swinging wide and low, trying to catch Jed off balance. But Jed knew the rhythm of men who fought for ego, not survival. He deflected the first lunge, twisted and struck back, nicking Morrison's coat and earning a hissed curse. The blades clanged, echoed through the canyon like church bells. The boys watched from behind a rusted ore cart, eyes wide, breaths held. Jed moved with quiet fury, his feet grounded like tree roots. Morrison fought with flash, with spite. Each strike came with a word, a bitter syllable from 20 years of hate. You took him! Clang. You ruined me! Clang. You made me into this... Clang. Jed caught Morrison's wrist and shoved him back. You did that yourself! Morrison roared and charged, blade arcing toward Jed's shoulder, but Jed pivoted, dropped low, and sliced clean across Morrison's thigh. The man stumbled, and that's when Jed saw it. A second blade, hidden behind Morrison's back. He reached for it, desperate. Jed reacted without thought. He brought his father's sword down, fast and sure. Morrison dropped. For a moment, everything stood still. Then his men stepped forward. Guns cocked, Jed raised the bloodied sword. That's twice I've buried a Morrison. You really want to be the third? They hesitated. Behind them, a voice shouted, Sheriff's coming! Riders from Las Cruces! Vicente's voice, loud and true. Panic spread through Morrison's men like wildfire. Two dropped their rifles and bolted. The others followed. Jed dropped to one knee. Samuel rushed to him. You're bleeding. Just a scratch. He wasn't sure that was true. But the boys were safe, and Amelia, she ran to them then, arms around both brothers, sobbing like a dam had broken. Jed just stood there, sword still in hand, the canyon wind drying blood on the blade. He stared down at Morrison's lifeless body, wondering how many ghosts this victory would raise. Then, out of the silence, a low whimper. A fourth child. Jed turned. Buried in the shadows behind an ore bin was a small girl, blonde hair, tattered dress. No more than 7. She wasn't one of his, but she had Morrison's eyes. The canyon had gone quiet, save for the wind and the rasp of Morrison's breath. Jed stood over the man who'd stolen his children, shattered his past, and tried to rewrite his future in blood. Morrison lay slumped against the canyon wall, a deep gash across his ribs and another through his thigh, both bleeding slow and heavy. His saber was gone, his strength with it. Jed still held the old war sword, its tip stained red. Tommy and Samuel stood just behind him. Amelia was between them, her hands shaking, her eyes wide and wet, fixed not on her dying father but on Jed. I told you I'd come for them, Jed said, voice low. Morrison coughed and blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. And you did. just in time to bury me. You made me bury enough already. Then finish it. Jed's hand tightened on the hilt. All it would take was one step, one strike. All the pain Morrison had caused, 20 years of bitterness, the long cold nights, the empty graves, could end right here, in justice, in vengeance, in a blade to the heart. But then Amelia stepped forward. She didn't plead with her father. She didn't curse him either. She looked at Jed, voice barely more than a whisper. "Please don't kill my papa." It cracked something in him. Jed looked down at Morrison again. He was no longer the devil in his nightmares, just a broken man with nothing left but a daughter too good for him. "I should," Jed said. "You deserve worse." "I know," Morrison rasped, "but she doesn't." Jed lowered the sword. It clanged as it hit the rock. Samuel's mouth parted in disbelief. Tommy grabbed his sleeve, unsure whether to cry or scream. Jed turned from them, breathing heavy, as if letting go of the hate cost more than holding on ever did. Amelia knelt beside her father. Morrison reached up, touched her face with fingers shaking from blood loss. "I was wrong," he murmured. "You hurt people." "I know. I ruined everything I touched, and now I want one thing." He looked at Jed. "Don't let them become me." Jed said nothing. Morrison's breath hitched. His chest rose shallowly. Then again. "There's a book in my coat. Inside it's names, ledgers, maps, whole network. Trafficking, debt labor, even lawmen. The mine." It was just one branch. Jed crouched and pulled the coat aside. Inside was a thick leather-bound ledger, sealed with a strap. Blood had soaked through part of it, but the pages were intact. But the inside names scrawled in a sharp, familiar hand. Locations, payouts, payment routes across state lines, even bribes. It was deeper than Jed imagined. Morrison coughed again. "They'll come for you. Once they know I talked, they'll burn this whole canyon down." "Let them try," Jed muttered. Morrison's eyes fluttered. "Just protect them." Then he fell still. Amelia collapsed forward, sobbing into her father's chest. She wasn't crying for the man he'd been, but for the man he might have been in some other life. One where he wasn't full of hate. One where he hadn't lost everything to vengeance. Jed didn't speak. He let her cry. Samuel and Tommy stood to the side, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. They watched Jed, watched the quiet storm in his shoulders, the weight pressing down on him now heavier than when he first picked up that sword. The sun began to drop behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the bodies and dust. They buried Morrison beneath a pile of stones not far from the mine. Jed said nothing as they worked. Neither did Amelia. Only after the last rock was placed did she speak again. "What happens now?" Jed looked at her, at the boys, at the little girl with Morrison's eyes still curled up beside the ore cart, sucking her thumb. "Now," he said, "we ride." "Where?" He held up the ledger. "To finish what he started, and burn the rest of it to the ground." Behind them, from the ridge, a whistle echoed. "Vicente. Back up. Sheriff's men. Too late for the fight, but maybe not too late for justice." Jed mounted, helping each of the kids up behind him or beside. He looked back at the mine once, then turned away. But somewhere deep in the canyon, among the rocks and shadows, a pair of eyes watched from behind a ledge. One of Morrison's men hadn't run, and he was already on his way to warn the others. The trail back to Socorro felt longer than when they'd left it, but the air smelled different now, less like ash and revenge, more like spring. Jed rode with Tommy slumped against his chest, worn out from days of fear and fighting. Samuel sat behind him, clutching the old war saber with both hands, as if holding on to the legacy of something bigger than himself. Amelia rode beside them, eyes fixed ahead, her face unreadable. They passed the burned outskirts of Las Cruces, through long fields of sun-baked sage, and into the dusty familiarity of home. The Freeman Ranch came into view as the sun dipped low broken fence posts, the leaning barn, the windmill still creaking like it had been waiting all this time for children to run beneath it again. But this time, Jed wasn't alone. Vicente rode out from town to meet them. His horse kicked up dust, but his eyes were warm. "You did it," he said, voice caught somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Jed nodded. Not all of it, but enough. But he handed Vicente the blood-stained ledger. Names, maps, where they kept the children, where the money flows. And who was paid to keep it quiet? Vicente flipped it open. His face darkened. "Some of these names, they sit at our own dinner tables." "Then you know what to do." Vicente gave a small nod. "What about Morrison?" Jed looked back at the trail, buried. Along with the worst of himself, Vicente squinted toward the kids. "And them?" Jed looked down at Tommy, still sleeping. "Mine, if they'll have me." The town of Socorro gathered the next day. They didn't ask questions. They saw the bruises on the children, the thinness of their arms, the wary way Amelia flinched at every loud sound. But they also saw the way Jed stood behind them, not as a man who'd rescued someone else's kids, but as one who had found his own again. The Reverend opened the chapel doors. Mrs. Callahan from the bakery brought bread and stew. The ironmonger built a swing from the tree beside the general store. One by one, the town stepped forward, not to praise Jed, but to surround the children, to say in every gesture, "You're safe now." 3 days later, Judge Fenton rode in from Socorro, summoned by Vicente. He reviewed the papers, the ledger, the testimony of Amelia and Samuel, and Morrison's final confession. Then he looked at Jed. "You sure you want this responsibility?" "They ain't exactly light baggage," Jed didn't blink. "They're mine. Always were." The judge scratched his beard. "A former cavalry scout, a man who hasn't spoken to half this town in 5 years, wants to raise 3 children, one of them Morrison's blood?" Jed nodded. Fenton leaned back. "All right then. Signed, sealed. They're yours." He stood, tipped his hat to the children, and said softly, "Welcome home." They moved into the house that same night. Jed spent the first evening fixing the squeaky door on Amelia's room, nailing up planks over the broken window in Tommy's, and pulling down his old war trunk for Samuel to sort through. Inside were keepsakes from a lifelong buried letters from his wife, his father's pocket knife, and the medal he never wore. By the second morning, laughter filled the ranch. Tommy chased chickens barefoot. Amelia helped plant carrots. Samuel tried to mend a saddle strap and refused help. Jed watched from the porch, coffee in hand, wondering if he deserved this, wondering if anything so broken could ever be whole again. But when Amelia brought him a slice of bread with too much jam and said, "You don't have to fix everything, you know," he finally smiled. Late one night, while cleaning out the barn loft for extra space, Jed stumbled upon something wedged between old hay bales, another small satchel. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, smudged with age, marked with Morrison's handwriting. It detailed 3 more holding camps, one of them just south of Tucson. Underneath, scrawled in the margin, were 5 names. None of them were Morrison's. One was a federal marshal. Jed stared at the names for a long time. He didn't wake the children. He folded the map, tucked it into his coat pocket, and went back inside. But he didn't sleep. Outside, the desert wind picked up. A coyote howled in the distance. And inside that warm wooden home, Samuel stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about trains and fire. Jed sat by the window all night, eyes scanning the horizon, knowing peace, however sweet, was never promised to men like him. But if there were still children out there in chains, He'd ride again. The wind that once howled through the empty Freeman ranch now carried something softer. Children's voices, the clatter of tools, the thud of hooves across the yard. Morning light spilled into the kitchen where Amelia was already up, slicing apples with the same focus Sarah once had when kneading bread. Jed stood by the old oak table, family Bible open in front of him, its cover cracked from time and war. He dipped the quill, paused, then wrote in large, careful letters beneath Sarah's name. Samuel Freeman, Amelia Freeman, Thomas Freeman. When he finished, he exhaled through his nose, blinked hard, and closed the book with reverence. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen, like sealing a vow. In the weeks that followed, life didn't return to what it once was. It became something new entirely. Tommy took to woodworking with an obsession only children and the broken possess. Under the steady hand of old man Keller, he learned how to saw straight, how to sand smooth, how to build something that would hold weight and not fall. The first thing he made was a wooden stool for the porch. Jed sat on it every evening, even when his back ached and the rocking chair tempted. Samuel, quiet as ever, began writing in a small leather journal. No one told him to, and no one asked what he was putting in it. But every night, after the dinner plates were cleared, he'd pull it from his pocket and write beneath the flickering lantern. Jed once saw him draw a rough sketch of Morrison's sword, with the word mercy scratched beneath it. Amelia surprised them all. She refused the ladle and broom and asked instead to learn how to ride. Not side saddle either. She wanted to ride like Jed high in the saddle, rifle slung across her back, wind in her teeth. Jed tried to teach her slow, but she took to it like she'd been born for the trail. Vicente lent her a chestnut mare named Jubilee. Amelia renamed her Sarah. One Sunday morning, after service at the small adobe chapel, Father Miguel called Jed aside. The priest had grown older, his shoulders stooped, but his voice still carried the warmth of a hearth. "You were always a good man, Jed." "Just hidden under too much dust." Jed looked away. "I wasn't good for a long time." Miguel didn't argue. He simply said, "Then start being good now. Not loud, not heroic, just steady." That same week, Doc Henderson stopped by with a set of new reading glasses for Samuel and some nails for Tommy. "Cost me a nickel," he said, handing them over. "But consider it a loan against all the heartbreak you're saving this town from." Even the stubborn townsfolk had begun to shift. Vicente organized a neighborhood watch that wasn't about catching thieves, but making sure no child in Socorro went unseen. Mrs. Callahan gave Amelia a part-time job at the bakery, and Jed watched with something close to pride as his daughter came home every afternoon covered in flour and full of opinions. They were becoming a family. One evening, just before the sky fell into twilight, Jed stood outside the barn and listened. Inside, Tommy was hammering together a birdhouse. Samuel sat nearby, reading aloud something he'd written. Amelia galloped Jubilee across the pasture, whooping with joy. "Didn't think it'd ever sound like this again," a voice said behind him. Vicente leaned on the fence, arms folded. He watched the kids for a while before continuing. "We found another ledger. Same handwriting as Morrison's, same symbols Jed's breath caught." "Where?" "North of El Paso, an abandoned relay station. 2 more names crossed off the list, but one ain't crossed yet." Jed didn't move. "Who?" Vicente looked over. "Senator Pembroke." The name sat heavy in the air, darker than the clouds forming on the horizon. "He funded half the camps, Jed." "He's still in office." Still shaking hands, Jed's jaw tightened. "Then this ain't over." "No," Vicente agreed, "but maybe now you won't be riding alone." They stood in silence, 2 men weathered by guilt and grit, watching the light fade over a ranch that once knew only grief. Inside, Amelia lit the lantern. It flickered to life, casting gold across the walls, across Samuel's journal and Tommy's sawdust, across the map folded in Jed's coat pocket. A map that pointed east, toward the man who made it all possible. And though Jed had built a new family, he knew this piece came at a price, one he still had to pay. Snow had started to fall over Socorro the way it did in years that felt gentle, not punishing. It dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, softened the sharp edges of the fence posts, and made the whole town look like something out of a dream. Jed Freeman stood on the porch of his ranch, coat open, coffee cooling in his hand, watching Amelia and Tommy string pine cones and dried oranges across the railings. Samuel was inside, lighting candles one by one on the mantel, a battered journal tucked under his arm. The boy had insisted on copying every family name into a new ledger, this one stitched by hand with leather from Jed's old saddle. At the top, in bold print, it read, "The Freeman family." The smell of cider and slow-roasting ham drifted from the kitchen. Amelia had spent all morning chopping, seasoning, singing off-key. Jed didn't correct her pitch. He just smiled. Her voice reminded him of Sarah's offbeat but full of heart. The ranch wasn't quiet anymore. Laughter spilled out of every room. Footsteps thudded across floorboards. A cracked window kept letting in cold air, but no one minded. Jed had fixed plenty of things in his life. Broken gates, stubborn horses, even the occasional piece of his own heart. But nothing had prepared him for how these kids had fixed him. That night, with the fire low and bellies full, Jed sat in the armchair by the hearth. The three children gathered around, their eyes expectant. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, time slowed just enough for a story. "You never met Catherine," Jed began, his voice rough but sure. She wasn't loud, not like Amelia, but she was strong, the kind of woman who'd walk into a saloon full of angry men and make 'em all feel ashamed just by looking at 'em. Amelia grinned and puffed her chest out. "Like me." "Exactly like you," Jed said, touching her cheek. He turned to Samuel. Sarah was fire and thunder, sharp with her words but gentler than you'd believe, and brave. Braver than most men I've known. She saved me more times than I can count. Samuel nodded solemnly. He had been writing all of it down. Tommy leaned his head on Jed's knee. Were they happy here? Jed looked toward the mantel where the two women's photographs sat side by side. They were. And if they were here now, watching you three, I think they'd be real proud. The room fell quiet. Then Amelia, curled against his side, looked up and whispered, "If Mama Catherine and Sarah were here, I think they'd be proud." Jed blinked hard, his arms folded around her tighter. He didn't answer, not with words, just a breath through the nose, a kiss to her crown, and a long silence where his heart finally settled. Later that night, after the candles burned low and the children were fast asleep, Jed walked to the small shelf above the fireplace. The old silver pocket watch sat there, unmoving. It had stopped at 11:47 the day Catherine died. He picked it up, thumb brushed the engraved initials, and stared at the still hands. Then, with a sudden quiet resolve, he wound it. The click echoed like a heartbeat. Time moved again. He placed it back on the shelf, but now it ticked softly in rhythm with the fire. Outside, Socorro slept. But something had changed. The town that once whispered behind his back now sent pies and firewood. The sheriff had come by just last week, asking if Jed might consider helping organize a new protective watch for the southern trails, not as a bounty hunter, as a leader. Inside, the walls of the ranch held more than memories. They held life, hope, family. But even as peace returned, Jed knew the world beyond Socorro still turned crooked. Morrison's ledgers had revealed names, big names, powerful men funding violence from boardrooms and bunkhouses. One of them was still sitting in Congress, and while Jed didn't crave revenge, he wasn't the kind of man to leave work unfinished. A new saddle sat ready in the barn, the rifle cleaned, the map folded and tucked into his coat. Next spring, when the snow melted, he'd ride again. Not as a ghost of war, but as a father defending what mattered. Not every story ends with justice. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it starts with family. And if you want to hear what happens next, how Jed Freeman takes the fight beyond Socorro, and what truths the Capitol will try to bury, subscribe to Western Legacy and stay with us. The story's just beginning.